Welcome to Work from the Inside Out, a podcast that highlights real-life stories, practical strategies, and best practices for transitioning your career from unhappiness and dissatisfaction to fulfillment, meaning, and joy. Now here is your host, career and executive coach, Tammy Guler-Loeb.
Hey everyone. I am really delighted to introduce my guest today, Rebecca Hinds. Rebecca is the author of Your Best Meeting Ever: 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. She is a leading expert on organizational behavior and the future of work, and has spent a decade helping Fortune 500 companies from Google and Dropbox to Salesforce and Pixar. She founded the Work Innovation Lab at Asana and the Work AI Institute at Glean. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Hinds. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thanks so much, Timmy, for having me.
I am so excited to have you here. As we talked a moment before we hit record, to me, meetings have always been a big thing on my agenda about making them shorter, making them meaningful. So I'm thrilled that you have written this book. And we're going to get to that a little later, but we want to begin at the beginning. And we love to learn about people's formative years. So tell us a little bit about your formative years and how they may or may not have informed where you are today.
Sure. So I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, and most of my upbringing from age 6 onward until I went to college and even thereafter focused on swimming. I was a competitive swimmer, and that was my life along with academics for so many years. And when I think about who I am today, so much of that is rooted in my career as a competitive swimmer. The discipline, the work ethic, but I think more than anything, realizing the power of team and of teamwork. And especially as I transitioned, I went to college in the US, and that transition from a quite independent Canadian swim system to a very team-oriented Division I collegiate program was a shock to the system in so many ways, in that you were a team player first, even in a very individual sport. And so the science of how teams work, how do you bring people together in a way that extracts the absolute best from every person. I was fascinated by that in the world of athletics. And then as I started to transition into industry, that passion for understanding the science of how we work, of how we collaborate, of meetings has stuck with me.
Wow. So I want to go back to Canada for a moment. When you started swimming competitively in Canada, did it feel more like you were competing with yourself, and that when you came to the US, it was more team focused? Is that what you're pointing to?
Absolutely. And I think swimming's always an individual sport, but it
Yeah.
shifted from being individual first, even though you train with a team.
Right.
It was very much that goal setting. It was always individual performance above all else. In most cases, I competed for Canada on the junior national team, and that started to become more team oriented. But fundamentally, it didn't matter if you weren't first and foremost a team player, if you could get the individual points. Whereas at Stanford, where I swam, it mattered so much more that you were a relay performer, you were cheering on your team. That came before the individual performance. And we had world record holders on the team where you could see it in them. It was much more important that they were lifting up the people around them than they were performing themselves individually. And it wasn't a false trade-off at all. I think I learned pretty quickly that when you anchor who you are and how you show up on the pool deck or in the workplace around other people and figure out ways to extract energy and give energy, that helps your individual performance. And in theory, it's secondary, but it ends up being primary in so many ways because you're using the team mentality to fuel your own personal success.
I can't help myself in saying that I always love the expression, there's no I in team.
Mhm. And it's true. And unfortunately, that's not often the case in the workplace, where so often how we develop our careers and how we design our organizations are oriented around individual success and individual performance as opposed to the team atmosphere.
Yeah. And yet there's so much power when you can have that kind of interdependence, really healthy team. So
Absolutely.
I'm curious, what did you study at Stanford? How did you blend that interest in organizations? Or did you when you first got to Stanford?
I did. Looking at colleges, I wanted to go to the US to swim. That had been my dream from a very young age. And I wanted to go into business. I've always been entrepreneurial. My dad's an entrepreneur. I knew that I wanted to go into business. Stanford doesn't have an undergraduate business degree. And so for a long time, I wasn't looking at Stanford because of that reason.
Uh-huh.
I took a recruiting trip for swimming and fell in love with the team, the school. I knew I felt it in my blood that I needed to be here for the next however many years of my life. And it ended up being a significant portion of my life with 3 degrees. But I stumbled across this discipline called management science and engineering. There was a senior at the time on the swim team who had majored in MS&E, it's called for short. And it was a really interesting hybrid between business and engineering. You had a cross-disciplinary education. You went to the chemical engineering classes, you went to the computer science, you did formally industrial engineering, and I concentrated for my master's in entrepreneurship. And so it was an amazing experience. I ended up doing all my degrees in that discipline because there's always more to learn about organizational behavior, management science, how do you construct organizations from the behavioral aspect, the psychology aspect, the financial economics aspect. And I just loved it. And that has instilled in me a passion for designing organizations as well.
So you went to Stanford wanting to swim on a US team, knowing that Stanford didn't have a straight on business program, and you found this cross disciplinary program, which sounds fascinating. So I'm curious, then you stayed the whole way through. Did you know that you wanted to go and get a master's and a doctorate as well at that point? It sounded like you found something you really loved, but I'm curious, when you landed your feet on the Stanford campus, you knew you wanted to swim. Did you see that vision of doing all those degrees there at the same time?
Oh gosh, not at all. I've always been a learner and I've always loved the process of learning. Academics have always been a big
Yes.
part of who I am and balancing that with athletics. And so I think if you would have asked me, probably I would go on to do something like an MBA. But I took a long break, reasonably long break, 4 or so years between my master's and PhD because
Oh,
I wasn't sure what I wanted to continue. I also love, tangible things. I mentioned entrepreneurship. I love building. And the idea of doing more theoretical PhD was something I was on the fence around. And
mhm.
so it took me the better part of 4 or 5 years to make that decision. And I was deferring and deferring and deciding when I wanted to make the leap. And
Mhm.
it ended up being 2019 when I decided to enroll in the PhD. September, as we know, I went into the PhD wanting to study two topics, artificial intelligence and remote work. And it was so serendipitous in how that unfolded because I had 1 quarter of regular classes and then everything changed when the pandemic unfolded. My research took on a whole new light and it became this fascinating surrounding, unfortunate, but fascinating surrounding ecosystem for me to do research on a topic that I'd been interested in for really 6 or 7 years.
If it wasn't such a horrific time in our lives, I would say, what a gift. That's amazing. That was your intention, and then the world opened up to that in ways you could never have imagined.
And it allowed me to study that transition in a way that we would have never been able to study. So my
Yeah.
thesis for my PhD was it was focused on remote workers who were in organizations. This was a big part of the PhD. It wasn't my thesis per se, but organizations that were predominantly in office before the pandemic. And so my co-authors and I studied the experience of these remote workers who were in the minority. What was their experience as their entire organization moved to remote work? And what we found was this fascinating leveling effect where, before remote workers were stigmatized, all of a sudden they were put on a level playing field. And so we studied all the different ways that the organizations designed that shift to happen.
Wow. It must be fascinating to see the shifts that have continued since then with all these companies that are now trying to push people back into the office too. We really need to understand all of that and see where does that place us. People are really looking closely at that. Tell me about your interest in meetings and how the book, Your Best Meeting Ever, 7 Principles for Designing Meetings to Get Things Done. How did that come about?
So I've, as I had mentioned, I've always been interested in collaboration, teamwork in organizations. And when we think about collaboration, so much of the dysfunction is often attributed to meetings. And so as I became deeper into the collaboration literature, as I began working with organizations and studying their collaboration, helping them fix their dysfunctional collaborations, including in remote and hybrid organizations, meetings continue to be the place that just evoke this visceral reaction where everyone has some beef with meetings and wants them fixed, wants them improved. And so I started to study meetings. After my master's, I went to Dropbox and studied an intervention that they called Our Meeting Get In, where essentially the IT team came in, deleted employees' recurring meetings from their calendar, and every day for 2 weeks, any meetings that were added back to employees' calendars by the employees, the IT team did another sweep and said, nope, no recurring meetings for this 2-week period. And I saw this sense of relief. It was after I joined, but we heard just how transformative this had been for the organization. And ever since that point, I have been fascinated by how do you fundamentally reset a meeting culture? And so all of the interventions I've led with organizations, I think in large part they were inspired by that early, conceptualization of Our Meeting Get In. And what if we didn't have to just surrender to bad meetings? What if we completely wiped the slate clean and started and rebuild from scratch?
Yeah. Wow. I like that Our Meeting Get In. I'm still thinking about that. So, what was your role at Dropbox? I'm curious.
So I think a common theme through my career has been a passion for interdisciplinary learning and execution. And that was true at Stanford when I was going into industry and I wanted to get that experience. I knew I wanted to build my own business and go into entrepreneurship, but I wanted the experience of a larger organization. That was my thinking. And so Dropbox had this amazing, what they called a rotational program,
Oh,
where you rotated through different areas of the business. And as I heard more about these programs, they're less common today, but they were quite widespread back in 2014 era when I was entering the workforce. I knew I wanted to go into a rotational program because I knew that if I wanted to get the experience of a larger company, the best way to do that was to be able to move freely through different areas of the business. And so at Dropbox, I did marketing type things. I did sales types things. I was in account security, tracking down hackers for a little bit, and had this amazing cross-sectional understanding of how a fast hyper scaling organization works. I later transitioned to start what they called a customer insights team, and that involved working with our largest customers at Dropbox to help them understand how their organizations are collaborating. And that was just so cool. And I think that experience where I was working with these large organizations to help them understand and fix their broken collaboration was something that I became very passionate about. And I ended up building a similar function, starting a similar function at Asana, and like Glean were similarly passionate about helping organizations understand how they work, not just using subjective data, but actually using some of the data that comes from technology and technology exhaust. And it's powerful when you can go into a conversation with an executive team and know more about how that organization works than the executives themselves understand. And I truly believe that's the future of work, is taking a more data-driven approach to understanding how we work together.
For example, a lot of companies will do employee engagement surveys and things like that. And yet, when they get the data from those surveys, they might put a few things in place that, from what I've seen, look like band aid solutions.
Mhm.
My sense is that you're looking at other ways to collect data and also looking at more systemic ways or designs to really address things in a deeper way. Would you say that's right?
Yes. And overall, you're shifting. We talked about the importance of teamwork and collaboration. You're shifting from an individual level of analysis to a team and group level of analysis.
Yeah.
And we know that it's pretty consistent in the research and evidence where organizations that are high performing, they're so much more likely to reward either informally or formally healthy collaboration within their organizations. And so engagement surveys, individual levels of performance are important, but the real gains happen when you incentivize, measure, and optimize at that team and organizational level. And so when you start to be able to see things like, in my organization, the sales org is not collaborating at all with the marketing org. And you can do this using often data from technology. But I've also done it with organizations where it's a survey. You go through a network type analysis survey, you identify who you collaborate with in the organization, how you develop relationships, who you go to for advice versus who do you go to for information exchange versus who do you go for mentorship. All of these network positioning
Mhm.
metrics matter deeply to individual performance, team performance, and organizational performance. And often organizations don't have a good sense of how their organizational network is constructed. It's
Mm.
often fundamentally different than what the org chart will tell you. And it significantly predicts performance within organizations, where you're situated, whether you're a super connector, whether you occupy a part of the network, who's collaborating with who, is the Japan office completely isolated from the San Francisco office. All of these things we can tell and dissect and start to give concrete recommendations to organizations in ways that fundamentally change how they think about teamwork and collaboration.
So, when you talk about the kinds of data that you collect on that, it sounds like there's a lot of qualitative data then that you're collecting. Is that right?
I've long believed that the more you can triangulate data, the more you're able to get a picture, a solid picture of what's actually happening. So the ideal case is when you have objective data from technology. Usually this is anonymous data segregated by teams or levels within the organization. Are the executives collaborating with the individual contributors? That also predicts a whole host of different outcomes, including culture and value for employees, but pairing that with the subjective reflections of employees. Why don't you feel like you can collaborate with higher ups within the organization? Why aren't you collaborating with this region? Then you're able to put together a more complete picture.
Yeah, so you're blending a variety of types of data, and you say using technology, meaning that you're doing some kind of surveys, questionnaires, possibly then departing from that, maybe even doing some confidential interviews and things like that.
Mhm. Yeah, the more data and the more different types of data,
Yeah.
the more you're able to piece together. And this is something that I learned. I knew intuitively how to do this before the PhD, but doing the PhD and really understanding, sometimes you go into an organization and act as if you're a regular employee. That's what I did for a lot of my PhD research, where full embeddedness within an organization, understanding what happens at the water cooler, how do people show up, how do people run meetings, meetings in particular. You can't have a complete picture just by looking at objective metrics. That
Right.
sentiment around how do people feel when they leave a meeting? How does the leader show up to a meeting? What happens in those first 10 seconds?
Right.
All of that matters deeply in getting a full picture of what's
Yeah.
actually happening. And very rarely do organizations invest in this type of holistic analysis in terms of how their organizations work, where really it's the most underleveraged way you can understand how to bring your organization along. And when we think about AI now, organizations that are investing in understanding not just whether the technology works, but how are employees perceiving the technology? How are they thinking about their relationship as humans to the technology? That's one of the biggest predictors of whether technology is going to be effectively deployed, whether it's going to boost productivity or not. And yet we're so hyper focused on the short term, the features and functionality, and not on the bigger picture of organizational change and the very human nature of organizational change.
Wow. Oh, this is resonating so deeply as I work with a lot of people who are working as leaders and managers and trying to bring these tools into their organizations. And I think you're shining a light on something that they struggle with. How do they bring it? How do they even have those conversations with each other? Or how do more technically oriented people have those conversations with people who are less technical? And not to convince them necessarily, but to just have a conversation about what these tools can bring and then let people have those experiences and have more conversations.
It's so important. And the amount of skepticism we see around AI is huge. And it's when you look at the executive level versus the individual
Yeah.
contributor level, completely different pages in terms of enthusiasm and optimism around the technology. And we've done research at Asana, we did research where if you present an overly optimistic and enthusiastic vision of AI to people who are skeptical, they often become more skeptical. You can present that exact same narrative, the exact same framing to people who are enthusiastic already. They become more enthusiastic in many cases, but the framing of the technology matters so much. And again, this comes in the PhD. I did a lot of work on and research on what's called technology frames. What are the mental models that we approach technology with? This is not unique to AI. We've seen with every new wave of technology how employees, how workers, how people frame the technology then influences how it's deployed. And rarely does a technology fail because it's not powerful enough. It fails because of human resistance and human resistance to change. And we're seeing that on a exacerbated level with AI right now.
Yeah. Oh, I want to say I love this. I don't love the resistance, but it really ties beautifully into what your book is about, right? That people will use, oh, let's have a meeting to talk about how many paper clips we're going to order next month, or I'm exaggerating, of course. It's like we get accustomed to doing things a certain way, and to make a change can feel very threatening if we don't know how to relate to it or how to learn our way through it. And the kinds of collaboration, the kinds of leaning into a team and being part of a team can really make a difference in terms of how we might adopt new technology or new ways of doing things. It doesn't even have to be about technology. And when we think about meetings, it really ties back into the collaboration, teamwork, all of those things. We don't always need a meeting for everything, but how do we talk to one another and work together?
Exactly. And I think it's unfortunate, but it should give us hopefully comfort knowing that a lot of this is natural human behavior, right? Just as it's natural for humans to resist something that's called artificial intelligence because by that very concept, it implies, a threat to human intelligence. It's very natural what's happening with meetings in the sense of we often think that more collaboration is better. There's a halo effect associated with collaboration. Meetings are so visible. They're the most visible way that we can demonstrate progress and productivity within the organization, regardless if anything is achieved in the meeting. At least we've done something and sat in the meeting and checked off a box. There are all these natural human tendencies. When you send a meeting invite, it establishes a social contract where we feel like we need to reciprocate the action by showing up to the meeting. Declining the meeting feels risky because we're not just declining the meeting, we're declining the person behind the meeting. So it's all human nature. But the problem is so often we don't stop and understand, okay, what is the human nature that's driving this outcome? Once we understand the human nature, we can start designing interventions and change initiatives that help to course correct and encourage the right healthy behavior.
Mm-hmm. It just occurred to me also thinking about the kinds of meetings that people might have to build new relationships or to deepen relationships when, let's say, they're thinking about their next move professionally. Not, and I don't mean just when you're looking for your next job, because it could be an internal move, right? If somebody is looking to advance within their organization or within their industry or profession, they might want to be having conversations with a variety of people. When we're talking about, I know we've been talking about meetings in the context of teamwork and collaboration, but I think
Mhm.
it's also just the idea of connections and connecting and building relationships, even one-on-one in that way. And how I think about some of the people listening to this podcast who are thinking about what's next for them and how they might best use some of your advice about meetings and about making the best of meetings in the context of what we call networking, right?
Mhm.
And when people hear the word networking, it's almost like another way of hearing artificial intelligence, right? It's like people get turned off by the word networking because they think it implies something that's artificial
Mhm.
or insincere, when in fact, it's really about just making good connections with people that can be reciprocal or, as we
Mhm.
talked about with teamwork, collaborative.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious about your thoughts on having good networking meetings or good meetings where you're building those relationships, whether it's for your own career advancement, your own learning to advance yourself, and you're learning professionally. It doesn't even mean necessarily, oh, I want to become a VP kind of thing. It
Mhm.
could be just that you want to broaden your experience in some way.
Absolutely. And there are so many different dimensions of this. The first I'll say is in the book, I outline a rule that I call the 4D CEO rule. So it's essentially a two-part test to determine whether a meeting actually needs to exist. The first test is what I call the 4D rule. A meeting should only exist if the purpose is to discuss, decide, debate, or develop
Mm,
yourself or develop another person or your team. Often we don't spend enough time
mm,
on that fourth T. Usually organizations use meetings as status updates, broadcast briefings, things that don't pass the 4D test. But developing yourself, other people, that absolutely passes the test
mhm.
and often requires a live meeting. Now, if it's developing relationships, that's a bit different. And the research would suggest that doing that outside a meeting, having a meal, bonding over shared activity can be more effective, but
Right,
developing professional development coaching, that's
right.
something we don't invest enough time in. And here again, if we think about network science tells us a lot about how to do this well. We typically know that some of the most effective relationships we have, certainly for finding that next job, happen through weak ties, not strong ties.
Right.
And so, again, when you start to understand the network, either formally or informally, you can start to understand probably you shouldn't be having a meeting with the person you interact with every single day, who you're already exchanging information with and knows you intimately, probably you should be finding someone in an adjacent department that shares some interest and has advanced in their career in a way that you'd like to emulate, thinking through that and who is the right person to develop your network around and with is also a really healthy practice to consider as you're thinking about how do you use these meetings in a strategic way.
And how do you expand your knowledge and information? Sometimes you'll hear somebody who has a whole different knowledge base. Maybe they're not even in your functional area, as you said, but they say something in a certain way that just sparks a thought in your mind that you hadn't had in a long time or never had. And you realize the piece of yourself that you didn't know you had. When it gives you a burst of energy or it gives you a thought to look into something to move in a certain direction, it may sound trite in some ways, but there are people who will say there are those moments, those turning points where I had this one conversation with this one person, or I met with this one person, and it changed everything, or it changed this one thing dramatic.
Mhm. And that's the single biggest way I think you could advance your career. It's the same reason why innovation happens and why creative outcomes happen when it's sometimes called cognitive wandering, right? When you wander off track into a domain or down a rabbit hole that you would have never done so if you were to stick with your routine and your traditional network. That's how innovation sparks. And I'm a little bit biased because I think this is how my career has unfolded, but the evidence would suggest that if you want to take a predictable path, stay within your core network, if you want to find a way to fundamentally jumpstart your career and have a unique competitive advantage within your organization, find some unique way to combine disciplines and combine two areas, two disciplines, two skill sets that historically haven't been intertwined.
And I think in today's world, it's almost imperative that you take that route. From where I sit with a lot of the people I coach, it's almost a demand that they communicate and work cross-functionally, or
Mhm.
things don't work very well at all. And you need to be able to look at things through other people's eyes. You don't have to have their expertise, but you have to at least try.
Mm.
And it goes back to what you were talking about, collaboration and teamwork. I love what you said about cognitive wandering and sparking innovation that way. And it's who wouldn't find that exciting? I love that. Having permission to wander cognitively is opening things up.
And that's why in the book I talk about walking meetings, standing up
Yeah.
meetings. There's a lot of research to show that it's not just exciting and jolts you out of routine. It also fundamentally changes how we enact those creative muscles, how we collaborate with other people, is allowing ourselves to have the cognitive freedom. And often we think that meetings should be highly efficient, and they should, but the purpose of making meetings more efficient is to give time, create space for the meetings that shouldn't be highly efficient. And these sort of creative mentorship, I learned this from my mentor, Bob Sutton. We need to think about not just hyper efficiency, but also what does that enable us to then achieve? And this could not be more important than now with AI, where too many organizations are laser fixating on the efficiency benefits when really, if we use this technology well, it should be freeing us humans up to do the things that we're uniquely suited to do that are probably going to be more inefficient.
I totally agree. I took a course recently in AI, and one of the first things the instructor said was, if you're going to use AI thinking it's going to be a time saver, this is not what we're using it for.
Mhm.
So and they said a whole lot more about it. That made perfect sense. Definitely. So if people want to learn more about your work and what you're up to, what would be the best place for them to find you, Rebecca?
Sure. So my website's rebeccahinds.com. A lot of my work and writing is there. And then the book is on Amazon as well as your favorite bookstore. And I'm also on LinkedIn.
Great. And we will have all of that in the show notes. And one final question, unless there's something else we didn't cover that you want to make sure we talk about.
No, this has been fantastic.
Okay,
I think we've covered a lot of dimensions
good.
for sure.
All right. As we like to ask at the end of every conversation, what would be a key piece of advice that you might give someone who is thinking about what's next for them?
I think it's that recombination of different ideas. And especially when we think about advancing in your career, so much of how we've designed our career paths and organizations traditionally, focuses on that predictable advancement, step A, step B, step C. I think now more than ever, it's important to think about, okay, what are those lateral ways you can advance in the career? And especially when it comes to AI now enables us to have expertise that we've never been able to have before. And so I'm consistently seeing the people who are advancing right now are figuring out what is my unique skill set and my unique why as an individual, and how can I use AI on the peripheral to create this really unique cross-functional skill set in a way that I now have an outsized advantage within the organization. And I continue to believe that that's the most powerful way you can advance and move forward right now.
I completely agree with that. I love the way you phrased all of that. I often will say to people, you can't just tell people what you do, you need to tell them who you are. And who you are is that unique blend that you just described. And it's hard, though, sometimes for people to describe themselves. But I think if they take the time to do that, and using AI can be a great tool for giving them some of the ways to maybe frame that. It's one way to look at it. I also suggest sometimes that people talk to people who know you well. They'll give you a few ideas about their experience of working with you if you're willing to ask them. And that can be some great fodder as well in terms of really showing up for who you are and enjoying your work.
And the other thing I'll say is I think it's still the outlier in terms of people optimizing for the team versus the individual.
Yeah.
The best leaders in organizations, they continue to put the team first. And you notice that. You notice the people, when we think about meetings, the person who designs a well run meeting and has clearly invested that time up front so that everyone else can walk into the meeting knowing that work will move forward. That's one of the most important high value skill sets you can use to differentiate yourself within the organization. And I think we sometimes don't appreciate that enough, even if it doesn't have a short term tangible value in terms of your performance review this quarter.
Right.
Everyone remembers the person who collaborates well cross functionally, runs a great meeting, and that sort of reputation will carry you very far in your organization currently, but also when you're looking to move to another organization.
Great advice, and a great way to figure out how to run a great meeting would be to get your hands on Rebecca's book, Your Best Meeting Ever: 7 Principles for Designing Meetings That Get Things Done. So, on that very positive note, I want to thank you so much for being here, Rebecca. I'm really excited about your work and what you're bringing to organizations, and thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been really fun.
Thanks for sticking around to the end of my interview with Rebecca Hinds. What is your key takeaway from our conversation? If you are interested in any of the resources mentioned in today's podcast, you can find them in the show notes on my website at tammygoolerloeb.com/podcast. Just look for episode 291. And while you're there, you can also subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss any episodes. Did you know that ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts can help this podcast reach more people? Please help me to inspire more people to move their careers in meaningful directions by clicking on the Apple Podcasts button right there. And then leave an honest rating and brief review. Are you anticipating your next professional move? Check out my award-winning book, Work from the Inside Out. Break through 9 common obstacles and design a career that fulfills you. It's available through my website, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, independent bookstores, or through your local library. You can also help sustain this podcast by buying me a cup of coffee at buymeacoffee.com/TammyGL. Since this podcast is self-funded, your support is acknowledged and appreciated. Thank you so much for listening, and remember, it's never too late or too impossible to increase your sense of fulfillment and satisfaction in your work and other meaningful activities. Let me know how it's going for you. I'd love to hear from you. Bye for now.
Thank you for listening to the Work from the Inside Out podcast. For more information, you can find us at www.workfromtheinsideout.com.